Hi, my name is Heather Havman, and I'm introducing all of our speakers. So the first speaker is Rochelle Terman, who is a postdoctoral fellow in political science at the University of Chicago. And has a PhD from Berkeley in political science from 2016. After that, she spent time at Stanford as a postdoc, and then escaped to Chicago, where she will join the faculty in political science in 2020 as an assistant professor. So please welcome me in welcoming. Sorry, please join me in welcoming Rochelle. Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you, Heather. Thank you to the organizing committee for welcoming me back to Berkeley. It's great to be here and see so many friendly and familiar faces. My name is Rochelle Terman. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Political Science at University of Chicago. And I work on international relations and specifically on issues related to international norms, human rights, and transnational advocacy. So today I want to share with you some findings from an ongoing project on human rights shaming from media, governments, and NGOs. This project uses a variety of methods and data sources, drawing on computational text analysis. None of the methods that you'll see here are particularly fancy or cutting edge, but hopefully they provide some inspiration or an example for how to apply methods to a substantive research project in the social sciences, especially for any of you who are just perhaps learning text analysis or went to the session yesterday. I hope this is useful for you, but I look forward to any questions or comments that you might have as well. Okay. So substantively, the project examines transnational human rights shaming. And by that I mean networks of non-governmental organizations, news media, international organizations, governments, exerting moral pressure on a state that violates human rights from the outside. So putting that country in the spotlight, urging reform, condemning violations. For example, when Amnesty International asks you to sign a petition on behalf of a political prisoner in China, or the UN Human Rights Council issues a resolution condemning state violence in Syria, these are all examples of shaming. The overarching goal is to examine trends in shaming practices conducted by a variety of actors. So the basic question that we want to know is who shames whom for what and why. And my co-authors and I use a variety of text sources as data in this project, including news reports from media outlets, press releases and urgent actions from Amnesty International, and statements from government delegates or leaders in international human rights forums. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to highlight 3 findings from papers that have come out of this project, and then I'll close by talking a little bit about where we hope to go forward. So the first paper looks at shaming by the media. Specifically, I examined women's rights reporting in American news outlets, New York Times and Washington Post. And using computational text analysis, I found that coverage of women's rights around the world is biased. And it's biased specifically in a way that stigmatizes Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, as being distinctly sexist. Okay? So how did I get there at that conclusion? So I first collected all articles about women abroad that were published in the New York Times and Washington Post between 1980 and 2014. So that makes a bit over 4,500 articles in total. And they're on all different subject matter. So they could be about women in fashion, women in sports, women in politics, and so on. I then used a structural topic model, which I know many of you may be familiar with, to conduct a systematic comparison of both the quantity and the substance of this reporting. And what I find is that stories about women in the Muslim world tend to center around one particular issue, and that's women's rights and gender inequality at the expense of other topics. So in other words, when reporting about Muslim women, journalists will focus a lot of attention on this particular issue or topic, women's rights, and less on others like politics, fashion, or sports. And what's more is this disparity that we see remains even after controlling for real world conditions of women's rights on the ground. Okay? So in other words, US news media will pay greater attention to the issue of women's rights and gender inequality if the country that they're covering is Muslim, regardless of the reality of women's rights or gender equality on the ground. Okay, so that red circle there, that's just showing that the coefficient for Muslim majority of the country being observed is statistically significant with a proportion of attention being paid to women's rights. Okay. Okay, so the second paper looks at shaming conducted by governments. Okay, governments will often criticize or not criticize human rights violations of other governments, of other states. So to look at this, my co-author and I examined texts from the Universal Periodic Review. I'm going to refer to that as the UPR. Okay, the UPR, if you're not familiar, is a process conducted by the UN Human Rights Council to periodically review the human rights records of all UN member states, which is basically all states. And the way that it works is through a system of peer review, which I know the scholars in the room might be familiar with. So governments will evaluate each other's human rights record and then offer feedback in the form of specific recommendations. Okay, so here's an example, a real life example. Australia recommended to Antigua and Barbuda to accede to the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and take steps to remove the death penalty. Okay, so states under review, Antigua and Barbuda in this case, then has to publicly decide or declare whether or not it accepts that recommendation or not. Okay, so wouldn't that be nice in the scholarly world if we could just decide which peer review recommendations we're going to accept or reject? But in the UN Universal Periodic Review, that's the way that it works. So we can use some simple text analysis techniques like dictionary methods and information extraction to create a data set on shaming in the Universal Periodic Review. So for each observation, we extracted, is this a laser point? Oh, good. We extracted information on the shamer, okay, the state issuing the recommendation, the target, the state getting the recommendation, the actual text of the recommendation. We also classified what issue each recommendation was about. So if it was about women's rights or torture or the death penalty or whatever. We also were able to capture how severe that recommendation is. So some recommendations are quite lax. If you feel like it, maybe you would want to think about signing this treaty. Others are much more demanding. And so that's what that severity measure captures. And then we also captured the response of the state under review, whether it accepted or rejected the recommendation. Okay. So we were particularly interested in the role of geopolitical relationships in this process. Right now in the news, you might heard about the Saudi Arabia case, and a lot of people think that the US is not criticizing Saudi Arabia because of our geopolitical relationship between US and Saudi Arabia. So we wanted to test that more systematically and examine the role of strategic relationships in this process. So how does the dyadic relationship between the shamer and the target affect their interaction? So we looked at three aspects of a strategic relationship: geopolitical affinity, formal military alliance, and whether there was a material dependence, looking at trade and aid. And we find that strategic relationships do in fact play an important role in both the causes and the consequences of interstate shaming. So there are two main findings. First, states tend to go easier on their friends, on their geopolitical friends, in the shaming process, which might not be that surprising. But perhaps a little bit more surprising is that when geopolitical friends do criticize, their recommendations are accepted more often than substantively identical recommendations coming from adversaries. Okay? So if you get a recommendation from a friendly source, you're much more likely to accept it, even if it's identical compared to an adversary. Okay, so the last paper that I'll talk about uses that same data on interstate shaming, but instead of focusing on the strategic relationships, my co-author and I were interested in using these texts to examine the notion of normative community. Okay, so normative communities are like groups of states that share standards of appropriate behavior. International relations scholars often rely on a notion of normative communities, So for example, if you think about the liberal community, we think about maybe European or Western states that share a commitment to democracy and rule of law and economic liberalism and so on. But that notion is actually, if you kind of dig down into it, it can be quite difficult to operationalize and to actually examine empirically. And so that's what we tried to do. So to do that, we first transformed the data that I was just referring to just look at senders, to just look at the shamers, okay? And we modeled each state as a vector you can think of it as a multidimensional normative space based on the text of the recommendations that it offered in this process. And then we used a hierarchical clustering. Did you cover clustering this yesterday? It's just kind of a dimensionality reduction technique to partition states or group states into groups that reflect a shared normative commitment based on the types of recommendations that they offer in the UN. So this is some results. I kind of let you glaze over there. We got 4 groups here of countries. So this is an unsupervised clustering method. The interpretation of these types of methods can be quite challenging. So what does this mean? How do we interpret these kinds of communities? So to look at that, we identified specific issues that are distinctive to each group, meaning that they are commonly advocated by states within a community, within a cluster, but are less common among other states outside of that cluster. And so here's what we get. So these are the issues that are not necessarily most common, but they're most distinctive to each cluster. Okay, so if you look at group 1, for example, so group 1 contains mostly wealthy Northern European countries. And this group is distinctive on their emphasis on civil and political rights, including freedom of opinion, press, and association. They also emphasize international instruments, meaning that they issue a lot of recommendations demanding that the target ratify an international treaty. So contrast that with group 4, where the emphasis is placed really firmly on socioeconomic rights, so issues related to development, poverty, education, health. And unlike the first group, which emphasized international instruments, these countries tend to emphasize issues that kind of place more emphasis on national sovereignty, like freedom of religion and security. It's kind of interesting, just as an aside, that if you think about the international order, and if you wanted to kind of divide up the international order, you can do it kind of using 2 dimensions. One is civil and political rights versus socioeconomic rights. So, United States, for instance, ranks really highly on the civil and political rights dimension. But then there's the second dimension, which is the orientation towards strong global governance. And on that dimension, US is really similar to North Korea, right? In that they both are skeptical of strong international governance. Okay, so moving forward, just to wrap up, my collaborators and I want to look at shaming by NGOs, which is something I didn't talk about today. So we collected a corpus of urgent actions from Amnesty International, over 25,000 urgent actions. We also want to do some comparative work. So we want to see how the human rights agendas overlap and diverge between these different entities, between these different actors. That poses an interesting problem with regards to computational text analysis, because these are very different texts, very different kinds of texts, but we want to find some kind of commensurate categorization scheme or kind of thematic categories that we can use. And then, of course, we want to know whether shaming actually makes a difference on the target of the human rights pressure. So I'll leave it there. I'm not sure how much. Okay, great. So if there are any questions, comments, concerns. Yeah.
What was the clustering method?
Yeah, so the clustering method, I'm just going to go back. Okay, so the first thing that we did, so if you remember so this is what the data looks like, right? We actually use these issue categories. There are 54 issue categories. So we didn't actually cluster directly from the words. We already reduced it one dimension, a significant degree, by just looking at 54 issue categories. And then we modeled each state, Argentina, for instance, as a 54 length vector based on how many recommendations it offered in an 8-year period on each one of these issues. So Argentina might have offered 20 recommendations on women's rights and 10 recommendations on torture or whatever. Okay, so that's the first step. And then the second step was to find, once we actually had each state modeled as this vector, we could take the dyadic distance between each pair of states by just looking at their Euclidean distance. And then we can use that to use I used a hierarchical clustering algorithm, just like to create a dendrogram. Yeah. So which hierarchical clustering, I mean, it offered the same substantive results as like a k-means. The hierarchical clustering is just kind of more interesting in my opinion because you can kind of see, how these things aggregate up and down, So for example, in group 3, I don't have the dendrogram to show you, but these can be sub-clustered into their own subcategories. And then you can kind of see, you kind of go up and down levels of aggregation. Okay, oh, well, I think there is, yeah.
What is group 3? Because I'm seeing like Iran, Israel.
Yeah.
I don't know if, okay. And then Luxembourg, so what are these?
So group 3 kind of focuses on, I think the really distinctive groups here are, for example, racial discrimination, minorities, trafficking, things that relate to kind of freedom of movement. These are some particularly distinctive items here, but they're not as strong on international instruments. So if you want to think about it as that kind of like 2x2, but some where there's a substantive dimension about what kinds of issues, but then there's also like a procedural dimension. How strongly do you care about international governance? They're kind of low on international governance, but they focus on particular issues, especially with regards to ethnic minorities, racial discrimination, and freedom of movement. So freedom of movement are things like labor, refugees, and it kind of makes sense. Like Iran is I think has the most number of refugees. Hosts the most number of refugees in the world. That might not be true anymore, but it was true 5 years ago. Yeah.
What was the process in generating that 54-length vector? Like, does the UPR already put things into buckets where you have these just options you can click, 0, 1, or 48 or whatever, or do you have to interpret it?
So yeah, the UPR, the raw data doesn't impose these categories at all. So we had to kind of go through and kind of using kind of classical, code structuring, code book methods, kind of figure out what kind of groups, what categories made sense, and then apply them.
Was it easy to find iterator reliability there?
Yeah, it was. So I'll kind of think we should take this offline, but it was kind of interesting because we were doing it at the same time that another group was doing it. And that provided a great way to compare. Yeah. Do you have time for one more? Or?
We're out of time. Sorry.
Oh, okay, no, that's fine. But I'm happy to talk offline to anyone. Thank you.